So the Kennedy test starts off with about 20 fill-in-the-blank questions. I'll go through those first here, and then it finishes up with about 10 multiple choice and then a 10 or so matching. So if I ask you the question, who was the leader of Cuba in 1958, it's Batista. Who's the leader of Cuba in 1962, there's been a shift and it's Castro. I ask you questions about Vice President of 1960, and I would accept either Nixon or Johnson, but technically it would still be Nixon until the Kennedy-Johnson administration gets sworn in January of 61. How old was Kennedy when he was actually elected? 43 years old. What electronic gadget did Kennedy credit for his success in the election? And that would be television, TV. The 22nd Amendment becomes important in this election of 1960 because the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms and or a total of 10 years. Eisenhower was the first president in which he was constitutionally required to step down after 2 terms. The Republican candidate for President of the United States in 1960 was Nixon. Nixon ran against Kennedy in 1960. Nixon was also a presidential candidate in 1968 and 1972, quite a bit later. The Democrat candidate for President for the United States in 1960 was Kennedy. So Kennedy-Johnson are the Democrats, and Nixon is presidential candidate in 1960 as well. The disaster that occurs in Cuba in early 1961, remember Kennedy gets sworn in January of 1961. By April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs occurs. The Bay of Pigs. The advising group charged with advising Kennedy and coming up with a solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis was referred to as the Executive Committee. The United States ambassador to the United Nations in 1962. He was also a presidential candidate in both 52 and 56, challenging the Republican Eisenhower in 52 and 60. His name was Adlai Stevenson. He was a presidential candidate for the Democrats in 52 and 56. Then he was appointed to be the ambassador to the United Nations by Kennedy's administration. Secretary of Defense for Kennedy was Robert McNamara. The Attorney General for Kennedy was Bobby Kennedy, his brother Robert or Bobby Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was the person who assassinated Kennedy. Then there are a question or two about the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court in 1962 was Earl Warren. Remember this from the Warren Commission that was appointed to investigate Kennedy's assassination, and also remember that the Warren Court was extremely active when it came to protecting people's civil rights, or especially the rights of the accused, especially when it came to a couple of Supreme Court cases such as Escobedo versus Illinois, Gideon versus Wainwright, and Miranda versus Arizona. The Miranda case, Miranda versus Arizona, leads then to your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to have these read to you. The Escobedo versus Illinois is the right to have an attorney present when you are questioned. And then Gideon versus Wainwright is the right to actually have an attorney, even if you can't afford one. The state must provide you with defense counsel. So Earl Warren was on the Supreme Court when all of this was going on. Where did the United States have missiles posing a tactical threat on the Soviet Union? These missiles were secretly agreed to be removed by Kennedy as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where were these missiles? They were in Turkey and Italy. Now there are a couple of things here, a couple of quotes by Kennedy. Kennedy is known to have said that the Peace Corps, this organization that was established under his presidency, the Peace Corps would bring a warm heart to a cold war, an army of idealistic and mostly youthful volunteers to bring American skills to underdeveloped countries. So the Peace Corps was developed to bring clean water to underdeveloped countries, to help in farming techniques. It was a humanitarian army to bring some warmth to a cold world. Kennedy was also known as saying, "Victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan." He made this quote right after the Bay of Pigs, basically referring to the fact that when there is a colossal failure, it's an orphan because nobody claims to be responsible for it. But when there is a success or a victory, everybody wants to be given credit for it. And then lastly, when Kennedy felt hamstrung by the knowledge that in a crisis he had the devil's choice between humiliation or nuclear incineration, the strategy that he used was sometimes referred to as flexible response. Didn't want to take a hardcore, absolutely unflexible approach, especially when a wrong decision might lead to nuclear incineration. Flexible response. One other thing that does occur under Kennedy's administration is the Soviets send a satellite up into space and successfully bring it back to Earth. And Americans go crazy. They become very paranoid, very anxious to the fact that the Soviets potentially could be a little bit further in their space knowledge, math, science, whatever. And so Kennedy initiates his space initiative, and he says in a very famous speech that by the end of the decade, we should be able to put a man on the moon. And he gave one of these speeches at a university in Houston called Rice University. It's a fairly small school. And somebody in the audience questions Kennedy, why in the world do you set landing on the moon as a goal? And his response was, why does Rice play Texas? And he's referring to football. Why does a very small school like Rice every year schedule the University of Texas? You're going to get slaughtered every year. And he's making reference to the fact that there's the dream. Do it. Why not? Why not do it? You might beat Texas. You just might. You schedule them every year. And it's this huge monumental task that you place in front of you. But you want to do it. And the same thing with landing a man on the moon. You just want to give it a try. And it's very important to have that ideal as a goal. So those are the 21 kind of fill in the blank, the first 21 questions of this test. The next part of the test has 10 multiple choice questions and then some matching. I'm going to go ahead and go through those real quick. The conservative Republican candidate for president in 1964 running against Johnson. The conservative Republican candidate running against Johnson in 64 was a guy by the name of Barry Goldwater. Very famous presidential campaign commercials involving Johnson and Barry Goldwater. A pivotal reason for the Kennedy defeat of Nixon in 1960 was the fact that Kennedy looked a lot better on TV, especially with the televised debates. Kennedy's presidency was dominated by a concern with international crisis and the threat of nuclear war. Under the Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court made many decisions strengthening the rights of the accused or the individual rights of those that are charged with a crime. Head Start was an anti-poverty program. It's a preschool education program for low-income families. That's Head Start. Medicare was introduced as a national health insurance program for people that are over the age of 65. Escobedo versus Illinois was a Supreme Court case that granted the accused the right to have a lawyer present during police investigations. Kennedy had several characteristics that defined him. He was a Democrat, he was a Catholic, and he was a World War II veteran with a very impressive record. Nixon, a Republican. He also had a lot of experience because he was 8 years in Eisenhower's presidency as vice president. And Nixon did choose as his running mate a guy by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge. So Nixon and Lodge ran against Kennedy and Johnson. Nixon and Lodge lost in 1960. The United States and the Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war because of this Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we have some matching. The Bay of Pigs was a failed attempt by the United States to disrupt Cuba. We have Fidel Castro as the Cuban communist leader. We have Lee Harvey Oswald, the suspect. He was suspected of assassinating President Kennedy, never went to trial because he himself was killed. Flexible response is having a variety of options with which to handle international crisis. Lyndon Johnson was able to push through many of Johnson's programs after Kennedy was killed. Kennedy he selected Johnson as his running mate in 1960. Nixon chose Cabot Lodge as his running mate in 1960. The Peace Corps was established to send American volunteers to work for 2 years in third world or developing countries. The Alliance for Progress offered billions of dollars in aid to Latin America. Nikita Khrushchev was a Soviet leader who ordered the West to recognize the sovereignty of communist East Germany and remove all American troops from West Berlin. The Berlin Wall is a barbed wire barrier erected by the East Germans between East and West Berlin that eventually was rebuilt with concrete. And a couple more. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain in 1963. It ended all above-ground atmospheric and underwater testing of nuclear bombs. So in the future, all nuclear bombs must be tested deep down into the earth. And Jacqueline Kennedy, JFK's Jackie Kennedy, his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, brought a fine appreciation of fine arts to the Kennedy administration. So that's the review for the Kennedy test.